Welcome everybody to this event that we have, this Linux at 30 event. It's going to be in two parts. In the first part, I'm joined by Mulder, our CTO, and we are here talking about Chariot's involvement and usage of open source throughout the years. So Aaron, I wanted to start off just by talking a bit about kind of our origin story as a company. You know, you and a number of other people who started Chariot started early on with open source tools, and specifically Java, which wasn't, I guess, was it open source by then? I don't remember. But what
it was that community license and all that garbage.
But there were other things that were part of it, I'm sure, that were open source. So like, what kind of problems early on did open source solve for us?
So, I mean, it's hard to think back that far. This was like the very early 2000s. And, there was no web framework. There was no, or it wasn't in common usage. I guess, struts came along at some point early on there. Can you imagine? I just said struts. And, there were JSPs, but no good frameworks. There was Oracle, but no good persistence layer. There was no Spring, so it was all well and dandy to say, let's use Java, but you go to do a real business application and you need to talk to a database. You need to organize your business logic. You need, transaction management. You need a user interface, so many things that we take for granted. You need to integrate with other systems, but there was no XML. I mean, when did XML come about? Maybe there was XML, but like XML parsers early on were like SACS, the streaming. Oh, it was awful.
Yeah, it was painful.
And open source was the way out of that, where we could use it because, people had these same pain points, and the open source came about as a scratch your itch kind of thing, right? You really hate XML parsers, you build some kind of abstraction layer on top of that. That means people don't have to deal with the fiddly bits, or you're tired of writing new web frameworks, for every app you ever write. So why don't we extract a common one? Or, you're tired of needing to write SQL queries. So maybe there's a better way to do database persistence. And, wherever we could use some quality open source, it was something we didn't have to write by hand, because otherwise you are writing that stuff by hand, and it's terrible, right? It takes the time away from writing stuff valuable to your application, and you're doing stupid infrastructure and plumbing kind of stuff. Early on, then I guess some of these things came about, Spring and struts, and there started to be open source databases and database drivers, and I mean, Hibernate has been around for quite a long time, it seems like. And every time we could adopt one of those, it just accelerated the actual application development, because it's that much, junk code that you didn't have to write, that someone else was maintaining for you. Now, early on, you'd run into things, and maybe that's how we ended up contributing back to some of these projects, when we found our itches to scratch.
I was thinking about that too. Like, you go back that far, and I'm actually going back even further, because this is technically the Linux at 30 is the main topic of the day. But, do you remember the first time you actually booted up a Linux operating system and set it up on your own on hardware? I know it's a little bit of a left turn from this, but thinking that's already 30.
Yeah, I mean, it was, I don't have a year. It would have been the late 90s or early 2000s, before we started Chariot even. And one of the reasons I did it is because I liked having a window manager that supported multiple monitors, and having some of these, text-based utilities that were better than the Windows command prompt or whatever. Being able to grep for something before the days when every operating system had search built in. So I used it because it gave me a better developer experience. And it was a little painful to set up, and it was a little painful to sort through all the window managers until I found one. I think I used Window Maker because it was kind of lightweight, but supported the multiple monitors. But like the process of compiling your kernel back then and
Oh, it was
having to
painful.
identify the chipset in your Ethernet card and,
Large
you
block
know,
addressing on your hard drive and not wiping it by accident when you set things up, and you name it. Yeah, it was, I mean, it certainly started off very, very much a hacking developers thing, but I remember the first time I actually used it in anger in a project, it was we worked for this one, I worked for this one company where they gave me a laptop with Windows on it and said, here, you're going to run VMware and you're going to run Red Hat Linux. I think it was Red Hat. And all your development will be in Red Hat Linux. And I used to do Unix years ago before that, so I was thrilled. But yeah, it instantly made me so much more productive, which I think now everyone just takes that kind of thing for granted who does development on a Mac, because the Mac is Unix, it's BSD Unix, which is another Unix variant. But you know, back then, the only real way to get super productive was to find a Unix machine to work on or use a Linux VM, right? So I know
and
some people at Chariot did that for a long time, right? Still do.
it's kind of ironic to say that I got into Linux because of the Linux on the desktop, not because of the server side, but
Really?
that's how it was for me. You know,
That's
the
pretty cool.
projects we worked on, you know, the client controlled the back end, and I think in many cases they were commercial Unixes or sometimes even Windows. You know, you could still run Java on Windows even if you had to figure out how to run it as a service before that particular open source package came along. You know,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
but for me it was about the developer experience, and then of course it was much easier to move over to running Linux on the server when that, you know, became a thing among more of our clients.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, at that time, that was like, you know, Red Hat was doing that, and there was JBoss, you know, so you had your open source application server from Java, you know, language platform. You had your, you wouldn't have to pay a license for something like a BEA or a WebSphere or something like that. That was, to me, that was like when we really started seeing a lot of people switching over to doing Java, was when it became not financially prohibitive to be a Java platform for a lot of companies. Um, do you think that was a major kind of change for us at Chariot too? Because that was just before I got here.
I mean, we spent a long time paying $1,000 a pop for JBuilder, right? For
Yeah.
the IDE. You know, if you ask Borland how happy they are that open source came along and there was Eclipse and all that, you know, I don't know what they'd say. But I still use IntelliJ today, so I'm still paying for an IDE. Thankfully, it's not $1,000 anymore.
It's half that.
Um,
But you get like 9 IDEs for half that price. So it's not that bad.
so, you know, there were a lot of things that were more expensive back in the day.
Mhm.
I have to, I'll give 5 more minutes. Everyone who's listening, put in the chat what the one open source project is you could not live without. You only get one. Because the one I'm going to pick, you used to have to pay for before this open source project or other ones, you know, like it became popular. And that was really painful. Like my biggest horror story was trying to avoid paying for an expensive commercial project and not having access to the open source one yet. And so trying to do it myself, it was a train wreck. All right, I can't hold it back anymore. It's MySQL. It's the database.
Okay.
I
All right.
require an open source database.
Oh, I can go against you. Postgres, SQL. There we go.
Postgres would be fine, you
Yeah.
know, any open source. But this, like in the 90s, it was like what the cheapest one was like Sybase SQL Anywhere or
Yep.
something that merged with Borland. You know, they were like again $1,000. And I had a hobby project that was the software for a tabletop gaming convention, and you know there was no $1,000 budget for that. And so, you know, I did Java serialization. That got pretty slow by the time you accumulated a lot of data. You know, 1 year after that, I tried to be clever and kind of have my data structure where I could put serialized Java objects here and there and not serialize the whole tree. And that went terribly wrong. That was my nightmare, where, you know, one pointer got out of whack and suddenly the data storage mechanism, I can't call it a database. wasn't working anymore. And I had these printouts of hex codes on the floor trying to figure out what went wrong. Oh, it was awful. And then, when MySQL and Postgres and those kind of tools came along, that totally solved that. And so there are a lot of things I could do with that today, but you will have to drag a database, an open source database, out of my hands, like kicking and screaming. That's the one I'd pick.
Okay, that's a good
I'll
one.
pay for IntelliJ. I'll pay for a text editor. I'll pay for, whatever.
So
It,
let's
it
talk a
would
bit
hurt.
about, yeah, go ahead.
It would hurt
Please.
to not have Node. It would, but every browser has a JavaScript engine. So there's at least some kind of runtime you can get at, right?
Yeah,
Every operating system comes with a browser. Every browser comes with JavaScript. So you've got something to work with there.
yep.
I would
So the
use
reason,
Edge if I had to, or whatever Microsoft. If there was no free browser, I'd use the Microsoft one. But you cannot have MySQL.
so let's talk briefly, let's get back to the conversation we were having earlier about your involvement and changing and making contributions to open source projects. You did a fair amount with the Apache Software Foundation with contributions. So I went through and looked on your list were, as you being a committer, were Geronimo, ActiveMQ, Camel, Service Mix, among other things, even contributing to the Postgres JBC drivers, according to this. And you're not the only person at Chariot that does it, but I know you were kind of hooked into the Apache team. So talk a little bit about how you got involved doing those things. Was it to scratch the itch of fixing bugs you found? And then what were some of the ways that you worked with them with these different teams?
So actually, the first one I contributed to was JBoss, and it was an itch I had. It was database connection pools. There was not a database connection pooling mechanism. And I don't even remember why that was an itch, but it was. And so it was something I worked on, and I ended up contributing it to JBoss because it was a feature they didn't have, and a feature I could contribute. So that was the very first thing. And then I got into the Apache community, and there are all these interrelated projects. I mean, like 90% of the ones you listed kind of can all work together or all share bits of things. Geronimo would use OpenEJB, and Service Mix and Camel shared some of the same functionality and whatever. So again, that was an itch scratching sort of thing where I wanted to have functionality in the open source community. And with Geronimo, one of the things we wanted was a very modular app server, because at the time, JBoss was kind of a beast, and it wasn't so easy to just take the 1 or 2 bits of it that you wanted and run only those. Today you don't even need that. You could just take Spring Boot or Tomcat, and so these things change all the time, right? What at the time seemed quite reasonable, let's just build a new modular application server. Today you wouldn't even think twice about that. You would just pick a different tool out of the toolbox. So we're kind of so fortunate today that we have so much open source to draw on, that we can do that. We can just pick the right tool instead of needing to write one from scratch. But that wasn't always the case. So, and I got involved in some of those things in very specific areas. In Service Mix or Camel, they were integration tools, and it wasn't the case that I was maintaining the whole thing or touching the whole thing. There would be one little module that wasn't there that I wanted to use, and I either had the choice of writing a whole bunch of code just on my own to do just for my app, or I'd look at it and say, well, now I've got to handle the startup and the logging, and now I've got to figure out how to hook that into something else. And okay, why don't I just use, a Camel or a Service Mix, and then I get everything that all the functionality that has, and I can add my piece on, and then it all works together. And again, you're leveraging what other people have already done and maintained, and some of the architectures and frameworks they've put in place, instead of having to come up with everything from scratch. So none of these things you listed are things like I did myself
Sure.
only,
Yeah, you contributed to them.
right?
Yeah.
They were things I contributed little bits to.
Yep.
The Postgres JDBC drivers, I contributed to the database pooling on that because I had done it before and I was familiar with it. It was an easy thing to do. Geronimo, again, I wasn't working on the web container or only a tiny bit on the EJB container, but, I worked on some of the modularity bits. And so it was the things I was interested in. And thankfully in these projects, enough people come together with enough diverse interests and you can build the whole thing, or you can, sometimes I felt like I was just joining the party, and Camel and Service Mix, I wasn't even involved in the original idea or anything. I just saw it was there and I was like, oh, hey, I could just add my bit onto that and it'd be great. And many of these we did use for customers, though it wasn't always, that's not always how these things originated. I worked on ActiveMQ, I think, before we ended up using that on customer projects, but then there came a day when, a customer needed a messaging system for real-time, I think it was real-time inventory for e-commerce or something like that. And we ended up using an ActiveMQ cluster. And again, today, maybe you'd make a different choice. Almost certainly you'd make a different choice, or maybe you'd use some cloud branded feature that may or may not have ActiveMQ behind it.
Right.
You'll never even know, but hopefully that's something, we'll get into in the second half of this talk about that overlap between open source and the cloud, and what happens if you're using cloud bits and you don't really know what's underneath.
I think some of this stuff too, like, some of these technologies, they have a small limited lifespan because they're kind of a bridge between one mode of thought and another, right? So you've got like when the web applications started showing up and were just web servers showed up, you started with like struts and things like that. Ultimately, then we kind of all landed for a while on either Spring or JSF, depending on how lucky you were.
Oh God, don't say those letters. Some acronyms should never be uttered.
I'm gonna duck. All right. So yeah. So but I mean, you ended up on Spring for a while, and then or things like that, and then there was the whole Rails wave. I guess one of the challenges I see with open source that you have to be aware of and pay attention to is that how long is a project viable, right? So, certainly the ones that are staying power, have staying power, for example, things Spring is still around. We use Spring Boot today. We started working with Spring, in 2008, 2007 or whatever. So it's 15 whatever plus years old, but it's stood around because it's still been useful and it's still, you can configure it in a lean enough way to get things done without having it take over all the memory on your computer and all the space. But that I think is one of the challenges with some open sources, that things will like get old and rust, right? So I know for a while we had done some Rails work, and Rails was really neat because you get things done so quickly in it and have like that immediate, you hit save, things keep updating themselves. You have to wait for a long compile and deploy step for everything. But I know people who worked on like a Rails 2.1 or 2.2, whatever, 2.3 project, and then try to migrate to Rails 3. And it had been 6 months, a year, 2 years. They find out, oh, all of a sudden, half these libraries are dead, right? So I think one of the challenges, and I don't see as much of a challenge, at least from my perspective on the Linux side, is that a lot of these open source projects have a lifespan that might be a lot shorter than what you expect them to be. So what are some of the things you might look at to kind of see what the viability of a library might be or a project might be for you when you're looking at them for projects?
Well, let me start answering that in a bit of a different place. And that is, I think one of the reasons Spring is still around today is because it's been very aggressively changing along the way. And I think the reason that some of these projects has come and gone is because as developers, what we're looking for has changed. And there are things we didn't even know we wanted. We had no idea, 15 years ago that we would want single page applications. We thought those JavaScript frameworks that just sat in the browser and made XML RPC, a little easier to use were the greatest things since sliced bread. And, now we're like, ooh, who would want to do that? That's just, Isn't this what we have React and Angular for, and Vue and all that, you know?
Don't you want to run Webpack for 20 minutes to build it? Teasing, it doesn't
So,
take that long.
you know, things do change, and in many ways, I think that's for the better, right? If we were all writing JSPs still today, that wouldn't be an improvement. I mean, we might be able to run 20-year-old code more easily, you know, but would that be good? I think we've become more productive, and we have much taller shoulders of giants to stand on, right? Um, and you know, you can. I have my own gripe with Ruby on Rails, and that's I don't think the Ruby gems system is as good as Java class paths and things like that. I mean, I had a lot of trouble with systems with the wrong gems installed system-wide that caused trouble with application-specific ones. But you know, whatever. I'm
Yeah,
sure that's
sure.
not the reason we're not as much writing as much Ruby today. But for me, you know, if it's hard to use things on hobby projects, then that's not what I'm spending my time on, and then that's not what I'm going to agitate for the next time a customer says, I don't know, you write in whatever you want to. So you know, back to the question you actually asked, you know, I think it is important if you're looking at open source to try to pick projects that make sense, that, you know, are going to be useful at least in the near to medium term, that have a good community around them, you know, that you don't feel like one guy's going to get bored and that's going to be the end of the whole thing, but rather there is a diverse set of interests. You know, if there are corporate sponsors, you know, there are enough of them, or they're of little enough importance that, you know, a changing budget isn't going to wreck a project or whatever. You know, we've seen stuff get forked when companies who owned it went the wrong way, and so, you know, that can happen too. But you know, if you said pick the web framework today you'll be using in 20 years, I couldn't do it. I mean, you know, I can pick the one I like today, but the way they change, there's been you know, no web framework that's lasted even, what, 5 years? I mean,
Well, you've got Spring MVC, believe it or not, which has been around for many years, but it has
yeah,
gone
but
through
I
a lot of
wouldn't use that
evolution.
today.
Yeah, sure. No, yeah, I get it. I get it.
I
But
mean, how long has React been here?
yeah, only probably 5. I'm thinking 6, 7
I mean,
at most.
Angular's been a while, but Angular.js
Mm.
was so different that I didn't
Yeah,
even know if you'd count that as the same as.
they're 2 different frameworks realistically. Yeah.
Um, so,
Yeah.
you know, Linux has been around forever. They are feeling the pain of that in some ways, I know, with still supporting 32-bit chips and whatever. And, you know, here we are with Apple introducing new 64-bit chips, and we can't leave behind the 32-bit chips from, you know, ages ago, the Core Duo or whatever. So, you know, what was the driver that just got hacked? It was like a SCSI driver or something,
Oh,
like
really?
something crazy that probably almost nobody uses anymore, but someone found a 15-year-old vulnerability. And so, you know, some of the legacy hardware that they support, I'm sure, causes a lot of pain. You know, and they have, I'm sure, pain caused by all the different vendors and all their different hardware projects. I mean, you look at all the different, you know, Intel Ethernet chips and all the different video chips, and, you know, the different vendors with different levels of support for open source and the video drivers. I mean, that has been very painful over the years, like which video drivers were accelerated well or not. So, you know, there's plenty of pain in there, but you know, it's not like I'd say leave Linux behind because of these things. You know, it's something that their community has to grapple with, and has, you know, pretty successfully, I think. Just like, you know, the developer communities have to grapple with changing web standards and whatever. You know, um, I I'm wondering if there's an open source project we've used and regretted, if we kind of look back. Um, I mean, I know, again, today we would make different decisions. You know,
Yeah, right.
we wrote J2EE applications that today wouldn't be J2EE. We use JBoss when today we would use, Spring Boot or Tomcat or something. So I'm sure there have, as is the case for all of us, you would make different architecture decisions and product decisions today. I don't know that I can think of one that really went horribly wrong, other than when I tried to write a database. Don't have me write your
Don't do that.
database.
That's painful. I would say if I had to pick one, and it's not art, it was more like being checkmated by a vendor. I would have to pick Flex, because I know we spent a fair amount of time on a couple of projects with Flex, and it's not a criticism of picking it in the first place, but Apple said, nope, not on this. And literally, not almost overnight, but short term, people ran away from Flex because they thought it was the next mobile platform. And then everyone kind of got disenchanted when they heard that Apple wouldn't put it on something. But so there's
That wasn't
sometimes
open source though, was it?
I don't know. I think it might have been. It was built on the ECMA syntax. That's a good question. I don't know if that was open source. That's a good question.
I would have thought it was backwards, that they released the commercial product and then tried to get some standards body to bless it.
It could be it. Yeah, that could be it. To me, that's not a good example, actually.
I mean, JSF, well, that's not open source either. That was quite painful.
Well, I don't think there are pieces of all these things that were, right. I mean, there are libraries. I think of like WebSphere Portal, right? You look at WebSphere Portal, and it's Apache projects all the way down, and other tools wrapped together with some glue that they wrote, right?
Yeah, but then now we're kind of getting into this angle of commercial,
yep,
and open source. IBM, and BEA and all those companies, they had this thing about building their commercial projects and then getting them blessed as standards somehow. They would come together in the Java community process and arrange for a standard that fit their product as best they could.
Right.
And it wasn't, it wasn't organic. It wasn't doing what's best. I was on one of those standards committees, and in the end, I felt like we didn't produce the best thing for developers. We produced the easiest thing for vendors to shoehorn what they already had into. And that was, I felt unfortunate, and it became a standard that no one really uses. That was tough. I think there were a lot of things like that. I mean, look at Spring versus Java EE, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, Java EE was how the vendors, managed to shoehorn what they had into a standard, but, all the developers, the kind of grassroots, were working on Spring and came up with something completely different, and in the end, much more usable. I mean, if you ask me today, would you rather write a Spring Boot app or a Java EE app? That's a no-brainer. I'd write the Spring Boot app, right?
Right, exactly.
Now, to what you were saying earlier about how old Spring is, I am sure there are rusty, nasty bits of Spring if you poked around.
Sharp Spring.
Spring Web Services, right? Who wants to do web services anymore?
Yeah.
So,
boy,
if we ever selected web services, that was a mistake. But I'm not sure. I think those things you kind of use what you have to integrate with what you need to.
The WS Death Star, so we used to call it with it. Fred just put in here in February 2008, Adobe released the Flex 3 SDK. That might have been under the open source Mozilla public license. That might have been when they were finally giving up on it, because I think that was around the time that the iPhone came out, if I remember correctly. So that could be
but
it.
in any case, you guys may have made the point that it was open source once upon a time, so we can count it among our open source regrets, I guess. I can't figure out why no one solved logging yet. Like, why do we need 57 logging libraries? That's even worse than the number of web frameworks we have. And then there are logging libraries that are just abstractions to let you use your other logging libraries that may themselves also be abstractions. And, oh, it's awful.
SLF for log for SLF for log for J, or something like
that.
EJB, yeah. Oh man.
So it's not to say that open source always gets it right, but I guess the reason we have 20 logging frameworks is because that's an itch that many of us have. And, at the end of the day, that's, I think, where the best open source comes out of, those itches. And the more common they are, the more people you can get involved. And
I was thinking also like the backward compatibility versus breaking things and moving quickly, right? So like, I think that the Rails community was more about break it and make it better, right? For example, and then you have like the Java community where in general, Java, the language, doesn't really remove anything that they've deprecated. The Spring team, for example, took a long time to remove things that they no longer considered important. I would say that would be the same thing for Apache and a number of other projects. So that's another kind of like pivot point for how you run an open source project, I would think. Maybe that helps with longevity, or maybe you've just got different, developer philosophies that match up with the developers who want to do the work. Like, what, I can take on, rewriting some of my code to get the better performance, or someone else saying, I'm in a larger enterprise with 40 developers that all need to work on this stuff. So I need something more stable and slow moving.
Yeah, I many times had the thought that it was crazy how long Java kept around deprecated stuff. Like, what was even the purpose of deprecating it if it was never going to be removed?
Don't you want to use hash table? Come on.
And
Or
I guess
vector?
it feels like in recent years they've been better about taking some stuff out that nobody was really using. You probably don't get JavaFX in your basic download anymore.
Maybe not. Or
So,
applet viewer.
but it's certainly the case that it's much more backwards compatible than some of these other things. I don't know. Would it have been so bad if Java had made a breaking change at some point and really trimmed out a lot of the cruft and modernized? Boy, that's a tough one to answer.
Yeah. Yeah.
And some open source projects are more backward compatible. Some of them aren't. You kind of make your choices, I guess. Some of these things are just changing so fast. I mean, I use a lot of Ionic, the web framework that also lets you build web apps for mobile phones, though I tend to use it more just to get the nice experience on desktop apps. But there have been major changes between Ionic versions, but part of that is because there have been major changes to the web in that time frame, and it wouldn't make sense to be backward compatible. I mean, using Angular JS today would be insane, but the early versions of Ionic were very tied to that, right?
Yeah.
So it's become much more flexible. You can use it with React or Vue or Angular or whatever. You can use web components. These are things that didn't exist earlier on. So sometimes when your open source is tied in with one of these things that's changing so fast, you almost have no choice. I guess Node has broken things more often than Java. I've found more things that won't run on a new version of Node or won't run on an old version of Node versus Java. It so far hasn't aggravated me that much. I've had a little trouble with the M1 Mac, that Node SAS won't run on the new one. It'll only run under Rosetta, whereas Sharp will only run not under Rosetta, or unless you run your whole terminal under Rosetta. Like, it gets crazy. So I won't say it's immune to that pain, but I haven't suffered much in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah, I'm just looking at some of the messages in here that we have in here. So yeah, we got some people. Fred has a lot of comments that he's bringing up some stuff that he's worked on in the past. So he mentioned he wrote his own JDBC connection pool library. We've all at some point built a second system, right? In the middle of trying to solve a problem, we might have veered down the road of, well, maybe I need something and it's not for me. You usually do that once. And then after that, it's like you realize I don't, like you said, I don't want to write my own database, right? You learn after that usually.
In my
But
case, I
sometimes
learned that I was spectacularally bad at it, or at least that the stakes were so high that one accident was devastating, and it was not the kind of thing to mess with. It's like lighting a firework that you're holding in your other hand or something.
this looks painful.
What
Yeah.
could possibly go wrong?
Yep. Or your own web framework. I know I've gone down that road very early on. What am I doing? We mentioned there's
one of the interesting things is we talked to a client, who was basically building their own single page app web framework, but it was before other ones existed, so they were very, very cutting edge in that sense. But, at the end of the day, when we evaluated, we said, I don't think you should do that.
Yeah.
You should use the code that someone else has written, even if that means you can't be quite as cutting edge yet. I mean, as it turned out, a year later, they would have been fine adopting, Angular or whatever. Um, but like to maintain an entire web framework, like,
That's hard.
I
Yeah.
mean, that's a lot of time you're not spending on your app, right? And you know that
Right.
someone is going to write a good web framework, even if you don't like the ones that are there today. One will come that you like. Like that's not where I would pick to build my own tool.
That said, if you're a tinkerer and you are early on in a new language and you want to try your hand at writing something that language doesn't have yet for a library, that's certainly an area to learn a lot.
But
You
get a
know,
team. Find
yeah,
some
oh yeah,
people
as
like
yourself, or one person's hard. Yeah,
besides just whoever you work with at your company.
yeah.
Get a gang. You know,
Hey, can we
it's
talk
so
about
much easier today.
can we talk about code like you were talking about like what is it? Oh, now my brain isn't working anymore. Hackathons. So was it true that like they would get together, like Apache, for example, would get together and at a conference have hackathons to help improve open source projects um,
Yeah.
for the
So
teams?
I mean, it's strangely applicable in the days of the pandemic, right? When we're
Yeah,
all working from home. But um, you never met anyone who you were working with on those open source projects because there'd be people in Europe, people on the West Coast, people on the East Coast. It wasn't like you could just pop down to the office and whiteboard together. So you were together in email and I guess at the time IRC, the Slack of yesteryear,
yeah, right.
and
The original Slack.
there were still ways to collaborate, but um, the conferences were a big deal when you know so many people from a particular project would get together, whether it was at Apache Con or Java One or whatever, and suddenly you had the chance to work side by side with these people who you had only been emailing and online chatting for, and there really was the opportunity to get a tremendous amount done. When you have all those people sitting right there, you have their undivided attention. You're not going to wait 15 minutes for a simple yes or no answer. Um, and you could save up for that. You knew it was coming. So you could say, oh, I got this real big problem I want to tackle. I could really use a second set of eyes. Let's just plan to huddle over a whiteboard, and they'd set aside a table for each project at the Apache Con conferences. There'd be one big ballroom that was just tables for different projects to gather, with a whiteboard and a power strip and knock yourselves out. And people would, drop in and out over the course of the weekend or the week or whatever. But it was really quite amazing how much you could get done when you got a bunch of focused people together who normally didn't have that opportunity. And so, today it's all groovy that we can all work from home, or most of us at least can work from home all the time. But, I wonder if we're going to have that same appreciation of a little bit of in-person time when we get back to that. Not necessarily. It's different than being in the office 5 days a week when everyone's there all the time and you're ignoring each other, like usual. It's different when you're like, we're going to have 3 days, we're going to make the most of it, we're all going to work on the same thing, it's going to be awesome.
Yeah,
And that's what those hackathons were like.
shared
um,
mission. Yeah, absolutely.
so maybe there's a place for the COVID hackathons once we all get our vaccines and whatnot.
Yep. All right,
um,
Aaron. Thank you very much for having a talk with us today about open source and our recollections of what we used to do at Chariot and still do at Chariot. I think it's been a good conversation.
yeah, it's been fun.